Without further ado, I'd like very much to introduce to you today today's presenter, Mr. Andrew Kavchak. He's a retired civil servant who holds a law degree from Osgoode Hall Law School and an MA in political science from Carleton. He's an amateur historian who spent over 4 years lobbying for the recognition of the Gouzenko affair and an event of national historic significance, which led to the unveiling of federal and municipal plaques in Ottawa in 2003 and 2004. He's the author of Remembering Gouzenko, The Struggle to Honor a Cold War Hero. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Kavchak.
Well, thank you so much, Louise, and thank you very much, Julia, and to all those here at the Friends of the Canadian War Museum for making this event possible. I've spoken to some high school classes in the past, and well, that's always a thrill, walking around and speaking with so many of you who are here today and with such a nice, distinguished audience. I'm reminded of an episode where Winston Churchill was invited to speak on one occasion, and after a glowing introduction, approached the microphone, and the first thing he said was, "I'm so excited I can hardly wait to hear what I'm about to say." Anyways, my favorite part of this museum is the entrance to the Cold War exhibit, because as you exit the World War II exhibit, the first thing that you are confronted with is a huge image of the hooded Igor Gouzenko. It reaches from the floor to the ceiling, and for those of you who remember, if you've gone through the museum lately, it really symbolizes what a giant Gouzenko was, and a domineering presence in that era, immediately after the war. And I think a lot of people forget that in 1946, the Canadian press began the process of annual designations of people who were newsmakers of the year. And the very first one in 1946 was Igor Gouzenko. So many years later, his story has largely been forgotten or relegated to the footnotes of so many history books. But this year is the 100th anniversary of his birth. And so I think it's entirely appropriate that we would now undertake a Gouzenko revival. And I'd like to start off with 2 short videos before going into my deck. And the first one, when I started this process of trying to get the official designation of the Gouzenko affair as an event of national historic significance, I didn't know anything about the family, apart from that I'd seen Svetlana Gouzenko on TV in the late 1980s. And I didn't know what their names were. I didn't know where they lived. And they were the first family, as far as I know, under the RCMP Witness Protection Program, who were given new identities. But I so much wanted to connect with them to let them know that I was pursuing this project to commemorate their parents. And I'm glad to say that it took a while, but eventually I did connect with them. And the eldest daughter of Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko, her name is Evie Wilson. I was so much hoping that she'd be able to make the trip from Southern Ontario to join us here today. Unfortunately, I got a message from her on Sunday saying that due to circumstances, she couldn't make the trip. But what she did do was tape a short introductory greetings video. And she sent it to me on a memory stick, which I got by express post yesterday. So I'd love to show that, and that'll be followed as a quick introduction with a clip of a interview I did with CBC News World in 2003 on the day that the municipal plaque was being unveiled. So if we could show the first plaque, and for the video streaming or recording, if we can keep the light here, but perhaps turn off the light in the back.
I hoped to be in Ottawa with all of you this afternoon. This didn't happen, sorry. I'm sending you and your audience of welcome visitors all the very best wishes. Thank you for being there. Your presence today encourages us to do further study of what has become known as the Gouzenko affair. The venue is perfect. The Canadian War Museum offers a reflective site for the review of the Cold War. One can argue is still raging today, and so timely. This is the 74th year of our parents' harrowing escape from Soviet tyranny. This milestone also marks the 100th anniversary of her father's birth in what was then communist Russia. Please let me take this opportunity to thank you, Andrew, again for your tireless efforts to honor our parents' legacy. Words fall short in conveying our immense appreciation. You have brought forward a keen public awareness of pivotal Canadian history, and with it, an accurate portrayal of the first resounding alarm bells of the Cold War. Those warnings told large-scale Soviet perfidy against the West. And as described in my father's deposition of October 1945, it was indeed a fifth column invasion. My message to you all today, like Andrew, we must never give up. Never give up protecting our basic rights. Many of those before us, my dear parents included, made what is possible today in Canada. Within the Western Alliance, Canada continues to play a key role in the global protection, security, and improvement of our freedoms worldwide. Devotion to the preservation of human rights takes awareness, preparedness, and resources. Working together for this important nonpartisan goal, we cannot be complacent or unwilling to do the hard work, lest we forget how many before us died for this very principle, freedom. Wishing you my best and hoping to see you soon. Thank you all.
A man who came to be known as Canada's Cold War hero is being honored today in Ottawa. On September the 5th, 1945, Igor Gouzenko defected from the Soviet embassy, bringing with him details of a communist spy ring in Canada. He was granted political asylum but remained in hiding for the rest of his life, often appearing in public with a bag over his head. Today, Gouzenko's bravery will be formally recognized when a plaque is unveiled in Ottawa. Andrew Kavchuk has been lobbying for years to get the city to honor Gouzenko. He'll be part of today's ceremony, and he joins me now from Donald Park in Ottawa, where the plaque is going to be unveiled. Mr. Kavchuk, tell me why Mr. Gouzenko is so important to you.
Well, I think Gouzenko is a hero, and he's my hero. And when the Royal Commission in 1946, studying his revelations, concluded its report by saying that by what he had done, he did a great public service for the people of this country and placed Canada in his debt. I think that says it all.
Do you have a personal, I mean, he may be a hero, but obviously for someone to mount a campaign like you have, you must have some kind of a personal connection to this story.
Well, I always found history to be fascinating, and in Canada, all the history relating to intelligence and national security matters and espionage always starts off with a chapter on Gouzenko. And I used to come to this park across the street from the building where he lived at the time of his defection, and I couldn't believe that something so dramatic that happened just 3 days after the Japanese surrendered and formally ended World War II was not here commemorated with some sort of a historic marker or plaque. And so in 1999, I began a process of lobbying both the federal and municipal governments to unveil a plaque here. And the city is unveiling a plaque this afternoon, and I received word from Heritage Minister Sheila Copps last July that she had made a formal historic designation of the Gouzenko affair and would be committing Heritage Canada to unveiling a similar brass commemorative plaque here in this park next year.
Now, is that the apartment building behind you?
Yes, it is. 511 Somerset Street in downtown Ottawa. And Igor Gouzenko lived with his wife on the second floor. They had a 2-year-old child, and at the time of the defection in September 45, Svetlana was pregnant. And it was here where he spent 2 harrowing nights where nobody was listening to him. He left the embassy with 109 documents detailing the extent of Soviet espionage. and wanted to go to the offices of the Ottawa Journal as well as the Minister of Justice, and nobody listened to him for 2 days. So on the second floor where he was living, he went to a neighbor's apartment because he believed that the Soviet secret police would be coming after him. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, they did. Mr. Pavlov, the head of the KGB at the embassy at the time with a couple of his thugs, came up the building and broke into his apartment while Gouzenko was looking at this through the keyhole of the neighboring apartment. So the drama here is better than any spy novel that I've ever read.
So was it top to persuade officials that this should be recognized and noted in some way?
Well, it most certainly was. I got a lot of bureaucratic runaround, red tape, procedures, delays. So far I calculated it's been 1,395 days since I started my campaign. By the time the federal government puts up their plaque, it'll be over 1,700 days next year. And I don't see why, it had to take so long unless if there was some initial resistance of sorts. But fortunately, it was overcome, and persistence pays off.
So who's going to be there today?
Well, the mayor, Bob Chiarelli of Ottawa, is going to be here, and Councillor Elizabeth Arnold for this riding, who has been really helpful in moving this along and overcoming all the obstacles that I've encountered. And there's a number of dignitaries who have been involved in the Gouzenko story over the years, who've helped the family. There's going to be a number of dignitaries from Parliament who I hope will, they've been invited, I hope they will come. And certainly I'll be here, and as will my family.
All right. Now listen, I know that the plaque's not in place yet, but give us an idea of where it is from where you are now. So if the cameraman there can help us out with this.
Okay. Well, the pedestal has been installed a few days ago, and the plaque itself is coming. It's going to be installed around noon today. It's coming from out of town, and it's just at a location about 10 feet right of where I am. It's going to be directly across the street from the building itself where Gouzenko lived at the time of his defection.
Mr. Kavchak, thank you very much for telling us about this.
Thank you.
And good luck today.
Thank you.
Andrew Kavchak led the campaign to have that plaque installed honoring Igor Gouzenko.
Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot to cover. Let's get on with it. This is a picture on the left of Igor Gouzenko that is available at the National Archives. It's the standard one we see in so many publications or on the internet, so on. My understanding is that it was given by the Russian embassy to the Canadian authorities when he came to Canada in '43. The picture beside him is the picture that's also in the Cold War exhibit that stretches up to the ceiling, which is one of the famous ones of him wearing a hood, which was to protect his identity. And the one at the far end, I think it was taken around 1949 or 1950, and you see there's Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko. When they defected, they had a 2-year-old son, Andrei, who's the boy on the right. Evie Wilson, whom you just saw, I believe is the little girl who's half clipped in the far right of that picture. And her younger sister is on her mother's lap, Alexandria, and unfortunately she passed away from cancer last year. She was a lovely artist. I met her on numerous occasions and miss her quite a bit. All right. So this is an outline of what I'd like to discuss in the next, I was told I have half an hour. World War II, parts 1 and 2. Igor Gouzenko, a little bit about his arrival and escape from the Soviet embassy, the reaction of the Allies, the Royal Commission of Inquiry, the spy trials, what were the consequences of the affair, a little bit about Gouzenko's life in Canada, a little bit about the struggle to get these 2 commemorative plaques, and then where you can go for more information. There, part 1. Okay, most history books, when they address the issue of the beginning of World War II, simply refer to September 1st and the invasion of Poland by Germany. And I would like to suggest that there are in fact 3 dates that are really important to understanding the beginning of World War II. August 23rd was when the Nazis and the Soviets, of course, signed their so-called non-aggression pact, which was in fact an aggression pact. because although they promised themselves not to attack each other for at least 10 years, and they made that part of the agreement public, which was quite a shock to all the communists in the West who were so anti-fascist before. What they didn't make public was the secret protocols, and that was the aggression portion, which was the division of their spheres of influence and their understanding as to how they were going to split the lands between them, most notably Poland, Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Those secret protocols were kept secret, and they were only found when the Americans captured the Nazi Foreign Ministry archive materials at the end of the war. So on September 1st, Germany invades the western half of Poland, and on the 3rd of September, UK and France declared war, Canada on the 10th, and on the 17th, the Soviets invaded Poland from the east, and in fact took over more than half of Poland. And one of the questions, of course, is why wait until the 17th? What was Stalin thinking? And he didn't want a two-front war either, and he had some squabbles with the Japanese in Mongolia, which he settled on the 15th, which released him to start that invasion of Poland. That period, while it resulted in Canada declaring war on Germany, nobody declared war on the Soviet Union. So the relationship there with the Soviets had always been, non-existent, basically, since the Russian Revolution. But it wasn't one involving any declarations of war. So between 39 and 41, the USSR was trading with the Nazi Germany and supplying resources, guaranteeing no Eastern Front. Poles were being deported to Siberia, etc. But what happened in Canada was that the Communist Party, which had been, and the CPC is the Communist Party of Canada, which had been advocating during the 30s against fascism and Nazism, was suddenly against the war. And so their propaganda was all an effort to reduce enthusiasm for participation in the war. And of course, at the very beginning, until at least the invasion of Norway in April of 1940, the history books describe that period of the war as the phony war, because even though the West had declared war, nothing happened. I was reading one book that I thought was fascinating, where one journalist visited the French border and asked the French soldiers, he said, "Look, there are German soldiers there, why aren't you shooting?" To which the French soldier responded, "Mais pourquoi ils ne sont pas méchants?" Part 2. Okay, part 2. Everything changed, of course, on June 22nd, 1941, with the launching of Operation Barbarossa. So suddenly the Soviets are fighting for their lives against the German Wehrmacht, and we have a common enemy. And at this point, I think it's Churchill who told his chauffeur that his primary goal was to defeat Hitler. And if Hitler had invaded hell, Churchill would feel compelled to at least say a favorable word about the devil in the House of Commons. Well, he ended up saying a lot of good things about Stalin instead, and Canada, like with all the other Western allies, ended up reestablishing relations. The Communist Party, which had been declared illegal and whose leaders had gone either underground or had been arrested, now suddenly was legal again, but it reconstituted itself as the Labour Progressive Party, and it now supports the war effort. So they switched again. In 1942, Canada and the USSR established diplomatic missions. In June of 43, Gouzenko arrived in Canada, coming from Siberia over Alaska and from out west. October 43, Svetlana, his wife, arrived, and soon their son Andrei was born. Now, with regard to the LPP, there was a period of time when quite a few municipalities and provincial government legislatures had a number of elected members from that party, but only one was elected to the House of Commons. And it was Fred Rose, who was elected from the Quartier riding in Montreal. And his first election was in a by-election in 1943, and then he was re-elected in a general election in 1945. Now, he's a major player in this story, as we'll find out in a few minutes. But here's an interesting trivia question. In 1943, when he ran in that by-election in Cartier, there was also another politician running for the CCF. Okay, I was going to ask, any guesses on who that was? It was David Lewis, right? Okay. Now, a little bit about Igor Gouzenko. He was born in a town called Rogachev, which is about 100 kilometers northwest of Moscow. His father apparently went off to fight during the Civil War after the Russian Revolution and disappeared. So he was raised along with his two sisters by their mother, who was a school teacher who apparently had quite an expertise in mathematics. He was a student at the University of Moscow in architecture at the beginning of the war, which is where he met Svetlana. And like with most young men, if you weren't in Russia, if you weren't in the Red Army on June 20th, 1941, you were on June 23rd, 1921. He very quickly was assigned to the cipher clerk school and ended up working for the GRU. Now, the GRU was the Soviet Red Army military intelligence. So in the field of security and intelligence, the Soviets had a number of different agencies, the most notably at that time the NKVD, which eventually morphed into the KGB, now the FSB. The GRU seems to have maintained the same acronym. So at this point, I just want to mention a few things about some other individuals to sort of set the background and the stage. And again, this is Soviet sabotage.
Sounds like it.
So, Ignacy Rice was an undercover NKVD agent in Western Europe in the 1930s. And when the Stalinist purges began, he decided he didn't want to have anything more to do with this. So he wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin saying, I'm done. I'm going to stay here in Switzerland, and I don't want to have anything more to do with your NKVD stuff. And 1 month later, he was assassinated.
Okay, so 1 month later, in 1937, Ignacy Rice was dead, assassinated by some NKVD hitmen. The famous story of Trotsky, of course, he was a Soviet exile, a political opponent of Stalin, went to Mexico, and in Mexico he had his head caved in by an ice pick by some NKVD agents of Stalin. Walter Krivitsky was another Soviet secret agent operating in Western Europe who, just before World War II, defected to the West. He wrote a book, I Was Stalin's Secret Agent. He, in fact, predicted the Nazi Ribbentrop Pact. And in 1941, he was found dead in a Washington hotel room, and it was basically described as a suicide. But I don't think anybody who knows how the NKVD operated at that time, or since, really thought that it was a suicide. And one of the more famous names at that time was that of Viktor Kravchenko. When the Soviets established a supply purchasing office in New York City during the war to buy or to acquire and order American materiel, Kravchenko was one of the officials sent to that New York office. He defected towards the end of the war and wrote a book, I Choose Freedom, which basically described what the Stalinist terror was like. And in 1966, in fact, in 1945, when William Lyon Mackenzie King met Gouzenko, he apparently asked him, have you read Kravchenko's book? You should write one like it. Anyways, Kravchenko also was found dead in his apartment in New York City in 1966, and that too was described as a suicide. So the reason I mention this is because once you're in the Soviet net, walking away was dangerous business, and you were literally taking your life into your own hands. So walking away in such a way that you couldn't go back and not having any advanced plan or arrangement for your safety and security really took a lot of courage. So I often ask university students that I meet who are studying history, when did the war end? It's a fascinating question because of the answers I get. I met one PhD student in national security studies at Carleton who told me he was pretty sure it was 1945. But when did the atomic bombs drop on Japan? He wasn't really sure. Not the dates, nor the month. Well, the end of August 6th and 9th, the atomic bombs were dropped. A few days later, the Japanese declared surrender, but the official end didn't come until the documents were signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. Most history books will say that the Cold War was the period that started right after the end of World War II. Some historians, like the late James Barrows, suggested, of course, that the Cold War started with the Russian Revolution. But if we assume that the Cold War started after World War II, then I'd like to suggest that the very first significant international incident of the Cold War happened right here in downtown Ottawa next to the Tim Hortons. 511 Somerset Street, right next to it is a beer store, and now, where there used to be a row of old-style townhouses, there's a Tim Hortons. So, September 5th, I told this story in the video, I won't go through it. It took 2 days before finally the RCMP called him in. This is the very first significant international incident of the Cold War, and it happened in downtown Ottawa. So, what was Canada's reaction? William Lyon Mackenzie's initial reaction was that he wasn't interested. When he was informed that there was a Soviet embassy official in the offices, waiting room of the justice minister, who had information about aspiring, and Gouzenko's first reaction was he didn't want to hear about it, send him back to the embassy because this could damage our relations with Stalin. Now, in fact, Mackenzie King was prime minister longer than any other prime minister in the entire Commonwealth and obviously had a touch for political longevity. But in this case, it seemed like I guess what could be described as the ostrich syndrome or something like that. But fortunately, Norman Robertson, who was from the Department of External Affairs and one of King's advisors, heard about this event and advised him not to send Gouzenko back to the embassy, but instead a decision was made to have the RCMP follow him and keep tabs on him. And so that night of the 6th to the 7th, when Gouzenko was hiding in the neighbor's apartment, and Pavlov, the head of the NKVD at the embassy, broke into his apartment. The RCMP were aware of this, and the next day brought him in for debriefing. And he began to tell his story, which included information about espionage that reached not just throughout Ottawa, but also the United States and the United Kingdom. So William Lyon Mackenzie King paid visits to Washington and London starting at the end of September to inform both President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee. And it's interesting that at that time, of course, the leadership of the Western Allied had changed, right? President Roosevelt had passed away, so Truman was the new kid on the block. Churchill was voted out of office. Prime Minister Attlee was the new kid on the block, which made Mackenzie King the corporate memory of the Allies. But the thing is that he was very averse to stirring the pot, and he didn't want to be seen as taking any initiative that could be seen as potentially reckless and unwarranted. And even in reading some of the notes in his diaries over the months, and there is a period of 2 months where his diaries are missing, but some of the historians have noted the fact that he was convinced that Stalin didn't know about this, and that these Soviet employees at the embassy were rogue agents, and that maybe he should just go to Moscow and patch things over with Joseph Stalin, which reveals a remarkable sort of naivete. But anyways, the thing is that he didn't in the end have to declare any of the Soviet embassy staff as persona non grata, because they ultimately were recalled, which saved him at least that public gesture. Now the documents, when Gouzenko defected, he stuffed 109 or so documents in his shirt and walked out of the embassy, which was extremely important because it constituted evidence. Otherwise, it was just his word against
everybody else's word. And at that time, everybody else thought that the Soviets had done a great job and were remarkable allies of ours. So the thing is that some other defectors, and I'll get to Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley in a moment, when they defected, they didn't bring any, or when they decided to inform authorities of what they were doing in the States, they didn't bring any documents with them. And so Gouzenko's bringing of evidence, documents, was extremely valuable. But what the authorities were mostly concerned about was getting evidence that could be used to justify arrests and prosecutions and obtain court convictions. So the legal standards of evidence production in courts is, of course, higher than just, everyday proof. And so the RCMP began to conduct a lot of, investigations, but they didn't have any experience in this. Most of their experience watching the communists was entirely in the context of revolutionary subversion. The whole espionage game was entirely new to them. And so the FBI came and debriefed or interrogated Gouzenko, and so did Roger Hollis from England, from MI5, and they gave tips along with Peter Dwyer, the deputy at the British Security Coordination in New York City, and they gave tips to the RCMP on how to conduct counterintelligence activity and investigation. Now, RCMP Deputy Commissioner William Kelly wrote a number of books about the history of the RCMP, and on the 100th anniversary, I think back in the 70s, 76, thank you. He wrote a book in which one of the chapters on Soviet espionage began with this statement, and I quote it here, that probably the most important investigation in the history of the force was the Gouzenko investigation. William Lyon Mackenzie King, on the other hand, his first public mentioning, or at least his first mentioning in the House of Commons about the Gouzenko affair, was on March 18th, 46, and as part of what he said, I included here the quote, "the most serious situation that has arisen at any time in Canada." In the USA, Gouzenko's information included a reference to somebody who was an assistant to an assistant secretary of state. So somebody fairly high up in the American Department of External Affairs, right, the State Department, which ultimately turned out to be Alger Hiss. And he also had information and leads about some others, including a scientist, Arthur Steinberg, who was pursued by the FBI. Apparently, his name was in many phone books. His name kept showing up, but they never found any evidence that he committed any spying. And there was an undercover agent, for example, Ignacy Witczak, which Gouzenko made a reference to. It turned out that Ignacy Witczak was an undercover agent under a false identity with a Canadian passport. And the FBI was hunting him down and following him. At one point, they believed they had him in their sights, and he quickly disappeared. So there were a number of other cases like this, which of course got the FBI going. And Hoover, in internal memos to his senior officers at the FBI, declared that the Gouzenko investigation was the FBI's top priority at that time. Now, in November 1945, something very interesting happened. Elizabeth Bentley, who was an agent within a communist spy network in the United States, provided the FBI with a lengthy list of communist agents, and her information basically corroborated what Gouzenko had previously provided, but also revived interest in Whittaker Chambers' previous testimony. So some of you who may know the Whittaker Chambers story, he ended up being a huge witness before some of the Senate Internal Security Committees and the HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, exposing the number of spies who had been engaged during the 30s. Chambers also was one of these spies who had, after the Soviet Stalinist purges, and particularly the assassination of Ignacy Rice, decided to walk away. And so he ended up writing a huge, thick, very interesting book called Witness. So the FBI launched a huge investigation, but unfortunately they had informed White House and top officials, and their physical surveillance likely alerted many of the spies that they were trying to investigate. And in the end, the FBI didn't catch a single spy in the act of committing any espionage. In the UK, MI5, MI6, and BSC got involved. So MI5, I think most people know, is the British counterintelligence or domestic counterintelligence, counter-subversion security agency. But what most people may not know is that they also have responsibility for the entire Commonwealth. So it was Roger Hollis, a senior officer from MI5, who came to Canada to interview Gouzenko and get whatever information Gouzenko had about the British connection. MI6 was, of course, in the loop. And BSC was the British Security Coordination Office that Churchill requested to be set up in New York, which was run by Sir William Stevenson, the Canadian man known as the man called Intrepid. And Intrepid, in many of the history books, is connected in this story. In fact, one of the books about him is called Intrepid's Last Case, and it's the Gouzenko case. There's a fascinating story that at the time of the defection, Sir William Stevenson happened to be at the Montebello Signori Club, which at the time was apparently a private club. And we're very lucky to have with us here today Mr. John Bryden, who wrote a book, I think in the late 1990s, who, if I recall correctly, went to Montebello, checked the records in the registry, and found that, in fact, in green ink, the person who was there at the time was, in fact, Sir Stuart Menzies, who was the head of MI6. And he apparently signed in green ink because whenever green ink was photographed by black and white film, it didn't come through. So, you know, who knows what really happened, but I'm going with Mr. Bryden's version. Gouzenko's information about the British was fascinating here because he had two references to Eli and to the first of the atom bomb spies. One of the instructions that the center in Moscow gave to the Soviet embassy was penetration of the Manhattan Project and getting atomic secrets. So Alan Nunn May was a British scientist who came to Canada, worked in labs at McGill University as well as at the Chalk River nuclear facility. And he was a spy who was fingered, but it turned out there were two Elis. One was, these were code names. One was a registrar at the British High Commission here in Ottawa. Her name was Kathleen Wilshire. So she was apparently a registrar of correspondence who was able to see and report on all of the communication going in and out of the British High Commission. And the other was a reference to a senior spy somewhere in British intelligence with the name Eli. And apparently, this Eli, when he provided information that was received in Moscow, was so important that it was always taken immediately to Stalin. But the British at that time didn't quite catch on to that Eli reference. They were mostly concerned about Alan Nunn May and the atomic bomb scientists. So this is fascinating here. He returned to London. They knew about this, and so they tried to keep tabs on him. And he was, what they found out from Gouzenko and his documents and the investigation that was carried on, was that he was supposed to meet with his new Soviet handler to continue spying operations. And the meeting was supposed to take place in front of the British Museum. He was supposed to carry a newspaper under his arm, and they had a code of greetings to exchange to each other. And they were apparently supposed to meet on October 7th. And if that didn't work, October 17th. And if that didn't work, October 27th. And the thing is that, I don't know why, every year my wife has to remind me of our anniversary, but I can remember the dates when Alan Nunn May was supposed to meet his Soviet handler. It's funny how we prioritize things. But the thing is that the British really wanted to catch him in the act of meeting with his Soviet handler because that would be evidence of espionage. And they didn't. Okay, we are going to have questions afterwards, but do you have an urgent one you want to?
Well, it just relates to this. So did you say the British were already on Alan Nunn May before Gouzenko's?
No, not before Gouzenko.
Oh, okay.
After Gouzenko told them about Alan Nunn May.
Okay.
And so they were following him. He went back to England. And they were, in fact, even on his flight back to England to make sure, he was getting off and going home and so on. And he started teaching at one of the colleges or universities there. At the same time, something happened in Istanbul that was really important. The Volkov attempted defection. Konstantin Volkov was a senior NKVD officer at the Soviet embassy in Istanbul. And the same month that Gouzenko defected, in fact, I think it was the day before, but it wasn't successful, which is why I say Gouzenko's was the first significant international incident. He walked to the British embassy and he told them, he said, listen, when I was at the British desk at the center in Moscow, I found out about a lot of Soviet spies in Britain and in British intelligence, and I'm willing to divulge this information to you, but I need a couple of things. I need security and I need money. Now the British, instead of saying step right in, they said, okay, well, stay where you are, we'll inform our headquarters. So they informed their headquarters, and on the 19th of September, 45, two thugs got off a plane from Moscow in Istanbul, drugged Volkov and his wife, and took him back to Moscow on a plane, never to be heard from again. So another example of why Gouzenko's defection really involved a lot of courage. Gouzenko knew that this could happen to him at any time. And it's one of the reasons why he didn't go to the police, because he was very fearful that the police were infested with Soviet agents who would betray him. And when he was asked in one of the spy trials, why didn't you go to the police? He said, well, they could have been full of spies. And when the defense counsel laughed at that, he said, well, why not? There were spies in the Canadian Parliament. And that quieted the defense counsel. And this was the problem. Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby. Philby was a senior officer in MI6. Born in 1912 in India, his father was a senior British imperial bureaucrat running one of the colonies. And he attended, like so many other privileged British kids, Oxbridge, right? Cambridge, early 1930s. And at a period of time when the capitalist world was going through convulsions because of the Depression, he came to this rather strange conclusion that liberal democracy was for the birds, and the best thing he could do to help humanity was to work for one of the greatest mass murderers in history. So he became a communist, became a Soviet agent, and dedicated himself to doing everything he could to thwart the West and to promote the interests of Stalin. And a couple of years ago, this one British senior academic, Keith Jeffrey, made a deal with MI6. He said, let me see your documents, the internal documents, and I'll write a book, but before it's published, I'll let you vet it to make sure you're okay with it. And the book was published a couple of years ago, and there was one article that came out to promote it at the time when it was first published, and the one in the Ottawa Citizen I thought was fascinating, because presumably if you're going to publish a book about the history of MI6 and you're going to just write one review about it, you're going to promote what are the most exciting or interesting new revelations that were discovered by the author in their research. And what he ended up pointing out, what was the main thing in the book that was reflected in this one article reviewing the book, was that, lo and behold, Kim Philby had thwarted the Gouzenko investigation and done everything he could to try to minimize its scandalousness, tried to issue soothing memos to say everything's going to be all right. He, in fact, predicted that Alan Nunn May would not meet with his Soviet handler, which was probably an event that he engineered himself, and basically did everything he could internally to thwart, while at the same time informing the Soviets of where the Americans and the Canadians and the British were at in terms of uncovering all of the secrets. While reading some stuff about Philby, I discovered that I, in fact, have something in common with him. Turns out I went to the same high school. In 1970, my father had a sabbatical, and we went to London, England, and I went to this British boarding school called Westminster, and I found out that Philby went to the same school in the 1920s. And what's more is I found out that in the 1930s, When Joachim von Ribbentrop was the Nazi ambassador to England, his son went to the same school. So this school had the distinction of not only catering to the British elite, but also some of the biggest names in communism and Nazism in the last century. While they obviously don't promote this in any of the school's marketing material, I can tell you that when I found out about it with a tremendous sense of relief, because I flunked out of the school. So I don't know what they were teaching those guys, but I was having none of it. Okay, 1946. Between the defection in September of 1945 and early 1946, nobody knew about this. This was extremely a hush-hush matter. This was not public. This was strictly the Prime Minister, Minister of Justice, perhaps the National Defense Minister, the police, the FBI, and that's basically it. And while the British and the Americans and the Canadians were trying to follow their leads and monitor the spies' activities, they couldn't catch anybody in the act of committing espionage. And finally, what broke the story was Sunday, February 3rd, Drew Pearson. For a long time when I read that, I used to get confused with Lester Pearson, but it's Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson was an American journalist. He had radio shows as well as syndicated columns in newspapers. Somebody leaked information to him about the Canadians holding a Soviet defector. So most of the books tend to suggest that it was Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, who ran out of patience and wanted to provoke something. So he fed the information to Pearson. Pearson blew the lid off the story. Right away in Canada, there was a cabinet meeting that followed, and it turned out that most of the Canadian cabinet didn't even know about it. So William Lyon Mackenzie King was informing his ministers for the first time. And when confronted with a difficult situation, what's the Canadian way? You appoint a royal commission. And it's not going to be just any commission, it's going to be one that's going to issue a report, and somebody's going to read the report. And anyways, so they appointed a royal commission. Now, orders in council were passed under the War Measures Act, which had not yet been repealed, which gave the police power to arrest the suspects. And the thing is that the Prime Minister didn't want to be seen as overreacting, but wanted to be reacting to information from the Royal Commission. So he insisted that they issue interim reports. So they would interview Gouzenko and a few people, and then right away, very quickly, they said, look, arrests are justified. So the first round of arrests took place on February 15th. About a dozen suspects were arrested and taken to the RCMP barracks in Rockcliffe. A lot of books refer to them as cells, but as far as I know, there's no prison in Rockcliffe. They were in the same facilities that RCMP officers who were on training were using, and the same food and so on. And the commission undertook its work and eventually reported at the end of June. And its report was published in July. But March 5th was a huge day. March 5th, 1946 was a huge day in the Cold War. A number of things happened that day. Number one is in Britain, they finally got fed up with waiting and arrested Alan Nunn-May. And it didn't take long before he confessed. Churchill, that same day, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. And the UK-USA agreement, which is the so-called Five Eyes agreement of signals intelligence and coordination among the English, the British, the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the New Zealanders, and the Australians, to sort of have a vacuum on all radio waves and so on around the world and to exchange information. That initial agreement, UK-USA secret treaty, was agreed to on that day. So the Royal Commission report, which came out at the end of, in July of 1946. I have a copy of it here. Two of the things that it says that I think are very memorable, which very few history books actually mention, is that the two justices of the Supreme Court, Taschereau and Kellogg, who were the commissioners, found Gouzenko to be an entirely credible witness. This is really important because so many times Soviet defectors are the subject of tremendous attempts at defamation and character assassination to discredit them and their testimony. And the other thing is that in the conclusion, the two commissioners also say that Canada owes a great big debt to Gouzenko. One of the things that they, of course, reported on was that although he had blown the lid off of a GRU, military intelligence spying, there was also an NKVD spying that he was not aware of the details, a naval intelligence spying, as well as a political intelligence spying. So the report was published actually in several thousand copies, and apparently the British government ordered thousands of copies to distribute internally because it was assumed that whatever techniques which were described in the Royal Commission report that the Soviets were using in Canada were probably used in other countries as well. So spy trials in Canada. Not counting Alan Nunn-May in the UK, there were 20 Canadians who were charged, 10 convicted, 10 acquitted. And I'm not going to go through these here, but I put this here because so many of the critics of the Gouzenko spy trials suggest, like Marilee Weisbord did in her book about the communists, her communist parents and that whole era, The Strangest Dream was the title of her book. She referred to this as the Canadian show trials, which I think is a terrible misnomer and a misleading distortion of history, because the show trials in the Soviet Union never resulted in 50% acquittal rates. They resulted in 100% conviction rates, all based on confessions extracted with torture. And I'm not aware of any of the convicted spies having afterwards said that they had confessed to something that they didn't in fact do. Now, Alan Nunn-May, sentenced in Britain to 10 years in jail, served 6.5. Raymond Boyer was a Canadian from a wealthy family, professor at McGill, developed an RDX explosive, apparently dozens of times more powerful than dynamite, and he provided this information to the Soviets. He ended up confessing and also being a witness against Fred Rose. And I'll just add one little anecdote here. I met years ago a friend of mine that I initially met in the 80s at university, and I found out about 19 years ago or so that he was working as a civilian at D&D, and I had lunch with him. We hadn't seen each other in years. And I mentioned that I was pursuing this Gouzenko plaque project. And he just mentioned to me in passing, he said that he and his family knew the Boyer family and knew Raymond Boyer. And I said, really? That's fascinating. Please tell me, what was he like? And he said to me, oops, help. He said to me something I'll never forget.
You're going forward.
Yeah, excuse me. About Raymond Boyer, he said that, and this is a quote that I wish the Guinness Book of Records would recognize as the world's greatest oxymoron. He described Raymond Boyer as a, quote, warm and sensitive Stalinist. Okay, Fred Rose was the MP who was the ringleader and who was coordinating so many of these things, handing off information and recruiting agents, and he ended up being convicted of conspiracy to violate the Official Secrets Act and transfer the RDX secret information. Gordon Loonan was another one of these Canadians there who was working for the Wartime Information Office, who ended up being a coordinator. He ended up serving 5 years in the penitentiary and subsequently wrote 2 books about it. A lot of people have said that these people had their lives ruined, as in the McCarthy era in the States, but in fact he ended up having a very successful, as far as I know, career in advertising. And he ended up, his granddaughter asked him to write a book, which he did around 2004, called The Making of a Spy. And apparently it was so successful, he decided to write another one called Red-Handed. Emma Woykin was, now this is a sad case. This lady, unfortunately, her husband had committed suicide and her infant child died at an early age. She ended up coming to Ottawa from out west. She spoke Russian of Dukorpor background, and she ended up meeting at one of these Russian Friendship Association meetings. she ended up meeting somebody from the Russian embassy who told her that in Russia, there's no poverty. Of course, if there's no poverty, then I have to be a spy for them. So she ended up giving some information about where she worked at the cipher division, confidential secrets of, communication nature between head office and various embassy missions. Now, of course, a lot of the history books say afterwards that none of the information she gave was of any significance or importance, but the fact is that she gave unauthorized information. David Sugar was one of the guys who was acquitted. And I think David Sugar really this case deserves to be, sort of really known. Because from day one, he refused to cooperate. He didn't want to participate in any of the interrogations by the RCMP at the Rockcliffe barracks. When he was told he had to be sworn in and testify before the Royal Commission, he refused. He complained, and his wife complained, writing letters to the Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister about his lack of access to a lawyer and to his family. And in terms of civil rights and legal rights, he was standing up for himself. And, in that sense, I think he, deserves to be recognized. His brother was apparently a member of the Communist Party, and he had attended some communist meetings, and at one meeting, he told Sam Carr, who was a recruiter for the spy network, who was also convicted, he told him that he apparently at the NRC was working on submarine detection devices. Well, that of course immediately got him on a list of targets to be recruited. But apparently the Soviets asked him open source information, which he photocopied from newspapers and gave them. And this was of course part of the technique to get him used to getting information and supplying it. And then they asked him for some confidential information, at which point he said, So after the war and the spy trials, even though he was acquitted, his career went south. So he, like Fred Rose, moved back to his native Poland. And he ended up dying at the age of 100 just a few years ago. And he had apparently quite a successful academic career at the University of Warsaw, wrote a lot of books and published journal articles. And just before he passed away, his family in Montreal started a campaign to get from the Canadian government an apology for his treatment. His grandniece in Montreal managed to get the former Justice Minister, Irwin Cotler, to table a petition in the House of Commons asking the Conservative government at the time to apologize. And I haven't found, I didn't look, but I certainly didn't see in the media any reports on what the government formal response to the petition is, but the answer overall was no. Okay, consequences. There are a number of consequences. This is the fallout of the Gouzenko affair. International relations. After World War II, with the creation of the United Nations, everybody was hoping a peace dividend would be available, and while Germany and Japan were being rehabilitated, suddenly the USSR became the new threat, which for a lot of people was a shock. Especially after the victory at Stalingrad, when so many people fell in love with the Soviet mythology. There was a lot of discussion around the time of the development of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project about civilian international control of atomic secrets. All of that, you can forget about it. Canada and the Western Allies then began a process towards increased collective security. So the UK-USA agreement was signed in 1946, NATO 1949. Internal security screening of employees, something that the British should have done before the war and caught people like Philby and so on. This became a major thing, of course, in the Western government and still is today. And of course, there was a renewal about the historic debate. Many left-wing and of course, civil libertarian critics were criticizing the government over the handling of the spies who had defected, or the spies who were captured and prosecuted. And, the legal rights in the context of national security were the subject of debates from the time of the Winnipeg General Strike and the adoption of Section 98 in the Criminal Code, and then afterwards the padlock laws in Quebec. But the way the Official Secrets Act and the Inquiries Act and the War Measures Act came together it ended up more or less reversing the onus of and burden of proof, where many of the accused were more or less treated as if they were guilty until they could prove they were innocent. And so this was a major step in the evolution of Canada's legal safeguards, which eventually led to the Bill of Rights and, of course, the Charter. In terms of Soviet covert operations in Canada, they were basically put on ice. Everybody was told to be quiet, not to be active. The Mitrokin from the Mitrokin archives confirmed that it was basically Gouzenko's defection put Soviet espionage back about 15 years. However, one very interesting thing. Gouzenko exposed the GRU spy network, but didn't expose anything about the NKVD spy network. And what we do know is that there was an Italian scientist by the name of Bruno Pontecorvo who came to Canada and worked on atomic research at McGill during the war. He was part of the NKVD spy network. After the war, he went to Europe, and in 1950, he defected to the Soviet Union, where every year in the Soviet Union, they apparently give a Bruno Pontecorvo prize to somebody who does something in the realm of atomic science or something like that. And of course, this was a major contribution to the decline of the popularity of the Communist Party of Canada. Okay, Igor Gouzenko's life in Canada, where I just want to wrap this up, a couple of things left. Well, he was given RCMP protection, taken to Camp X. 1948, he wrote this book called This Was My Choice, still available in used bookstores, and it's one of the greatest books ever written, although rumor has it that it was in fact more or less dictated in Russian to an employee from External Affairs who translated it and wrote it in English. It was published in the United States with the title The Iron Curtain, which was subsequently made into a 20th Century Fox movie. If you haven't seen it, I really suggest you see it. It's a fascinating movie. I thought it was lovely, especially considering the fact that the Americans came to Ottawa to film it. The defection took place in September, and there was snow all over the place in the movie. So, yes, indeed, we're the northern country. 1954, he wrote a novel called The Fall of a Titan, which won the Governor General's Award, and I'd just like to show you something. I had previously a copy of this novel without the dust jacket. I went in 1986 to a used bookstore on Spadina Street in Toronto, and I saw this one on the shelf, and it had the dust jacket. And I really liked the dust jacket. So I was curious, how much would it cost to buy the book so I could have the dust jacket? So I opened the book. Igor Gouzenko had a habit, whenever he gave away the copy of the book to one of his friends, of drawing a scene from inside the story and autographing it. Here he quotes the page. He autographs it with best wishes, August 29th, 1954. So of course this was something I just had to have. So the lady wanted $25. I was a student at the time. I asked her, I said, what's the best price you can give me? And she said, young man, do you know who that was? I said, no. All right, 1982, Gouzenko passed away. He was buried in an unmarked grave. This, of course, contrasts to the grave Kim Philby was given. And 2001, Svetlana Gouzenko passed away. And the last thing I just want to talk about here. In 1999, I was on parental leave. I lived downtown. I used to go to the park at Dundonald Park every day with a stroller with my son. And I looked at that building, 511 Somerset Street, and I thought, in any other country, there would have been a statue or monument or plaque or something to commemorate that something really important, historic happened here. And it really annoyed me that there was nothing. So every time I went home afterwards and my son was asleep, I would start making phone calls, start making emails, writing emails. And eventually what happened is I pursued a two-pronged attack, one with the federal government and one with the municipality. And I didn't tell them that I was trying with the other, because I figured, if the municipality knew that the federal government was looking into it, they wouldn't do it, right? So the thing is that I got a letter from Mayor Watson back in 2000 saying, yeah, this is a good idea, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it before the end of the year. And I was so happy, because at that time, I also managed to connect with Igor Gouzenko's family. I contacted John Sawatsky, who had written a book about Gouzenko, and asked him, what do you think of this plaque project? And he said, oh, why don't you call the family? And he he gave me a number. He said, I spoke with Svetlana back in the early 1980s. So I called this number. I asked, can I speak with Svetlana Gouzenko, please? And this guy answered the phone. He said, you got the wrong number. Click. And about an hour later, I got a phone call from a lady who said, you were trying to phone Svetlana Gouzenko. Who are you and what do you want? So I very quickly, before she hung up on me, I said, look, I'm just an amateur historian who loves the Igor Gouzenko story, and I really would like them to know that I'm pursuing a project to get this plaque unveiled. And she said, yeah, that's a good idea. We support that. And I said, okay, who are you? And the lady said, well, when they defected, Svetlana was pregnant. And in December of 45, she gave birth to a girl. I'm that girl. And that was the Evie Wilson that you saw at the beginning. So I was so much hoping that when this plaque would be unveiled at the end of 2000, I would come along with Evie Wilson and see this event. It would have been, I think, an absolutely historic, wonderful event. Unfortunately, what happened is the mayor resigned, there was city amalgamation, and some bureaucrat somewhere decided to postpone the event. When I found out about it, I was absolutely furious, but there was nothing you can do, right? I mean, you can't fight City Hall. So 2001, city amalgamation, cancellation. I ended up speaking with this one new bureaucrat who picked up the file who said, oh, the mayor, he didn't have authority to issue such a letter. He didn't consult with the federal government. And I said, well, okay, why don't you consult with the federal government now? And I didn't tell her that my application had gone to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Heritage Canada. So the government, the municipal government, decided to consult with External Affairs. So External Affairs, of course, told them, don't do it. It's going to upset the Russians. So I got a letter from the city clerk saying, forget about it, which really had me upset, but at least the process was still ongoing with the Historic Sites and Monuments Board.